Hello, everyone. It's actually very difficult to say hello, do not see you physically, but we are very pleased to be on Zoom, and I thank you for joining us. On behalf of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, welcome to this virtual event on the societal impact of GMOs, genetically modified organisms, featuring Nobel Laureate Richard Roberts with UC Davis Professor Pamela Ronald and my colleague, Professor Robert Martinson from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. We especially thank you for your participation, acknowledging that today we are observing Juneteenth, which commemorates the end of slavery in the United States. I'm Mila Pollack, the Executive Director of the Libraries and Archives at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and it is my pleasure to introduce this discussion as a part of the programming that we offer through the Center for Humanities and the History of Modern Biology. The center hosts lectures and conferences and meetings and workshops on the history of science and offers fellowships to visiting historians, filmmakers, artists, and writers. The Cold Spring Harbor Archives contains materials from around the world documenting the intellectual, social, and cultural history of biology over 130 years. Rich Roberts has chaired our Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory board over a decade and donated his original materials to our BGI Nobel Laureates Archives. And it is really my pleasure, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity, Rich, to thank you publicly for your generosity in helping to preserve and to promote the history of modern biology. So I would deliver this thank you to you on behalf of our board, on behalf of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, our president, Bruce Stillman, and thank you very, very much for your time and your attention to this very important program. Just a brief note about the format of the event. After Rich Roberts' talk, Pam Ronald and Rob Martinson will join Rich to discuss the topic. Rob, as the moderator of the event, will then present your questions. So please submit your questions via Zoom OA. And then now I would like to introduce you our participants of the discussions. Very briefly, the bio actually very, very long, but for today I will be very short. Sir Richard Roberts shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1993 with Philip Sharp of MIT, who spent some time of his career at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory for their discovery of split genes and RNA splicing, which revolutionized our concept of the gene. Rich received his PhD and bachelor's degree, both in chemistry from the University of Sheffield, UK. He did postdoc at Harvard University before working at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, New York, and in New England Biolabs in Massachusetts. His most recent campaign has been on the issue of GMOs, where 155 Nobel laureates have supported the use of GMOs techniques to improve plant breeding practices that could greatly help the developing world. And I'm sure that Rich will share this with you today. Pamela Ronald is Distinguished Professor in the Department of Plant Pathology and the Genome Center, as well as Director of the Institute for Food and Agricultural Literacy at UC Davis. Her book, Tomorrow's Table: Organic Ferment Genetics and the Future of Food was selected as one of 25 most influential books with the power to inspire college readers to change the world. Her 2015 TED Talk has been viewed more than 1.8 million people and translated into 26 languages. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Rob Martinson is the Williams Masterson Professor and Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. His research focuses on epigenetics and transposable elements, which were first discovered here at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory by Barbara McClintock. Dr. Martinson is a fellow of the Royal Society and foreign member of the European Molecular Biology Organization. Rob is a co-founder of Arian Genomics, LLC, a biotechnology company based in St. Louis, Missouri. And now, Rob, it's your turn. Please.
That's great. Thanks so much, Mila.
Sure.
That's introduction. So it's not much more for me to say. Happy Juneteenth. It also turns out that this week is Barbara McClintock's birthday. She was born on June 16th in 1902. So maybe we'll have to celebrate that. So without further ado, I'm going to just let Rich start his talk. After that, we will have a discussion mostly with Pam. And if you want to enter questions, enter them into the Q&A chat box, and I will then read those. Obviously, we won't have time for every possible question, but we will get to as many as we can. So thanks, Rich. You're on.
Okay, well, hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to do this with you. I'm going to start by recalling Barbara McClintock, who worked in a laboratory just underneath mine. We were very good friends, and I learned quite a lot about plants from Barbara. I never worked on plants myself, but I will tell you how I got interested in them, and in particular, how I got interested in the GMO edition. And I would thank Mila very much for running the archive at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. The history of science is fascinating, and Mila has done an excellent job in putting it all together and made a resource available for anybody around the world who wants it. This is an open access resource, and Mila has done a great job. Now, I want to tell you how I got started in this, and it arises because I went to Mark van Montague's 80th birthday celebration, which was held in Ghent. Mark is the person at the top right, and on the left with his longtime collaborator, Jeff Shell, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And at the bottom is Mary Del Chilton. And the three of them discovered that there was a bacterium called Agrobacterium, which was able to transfer DNA into plants. Now, when Mark was celebrating his 80th birthday, I sat and listened for a whole day to plant biologists in Europe saying just how difficult it was for them to do plant research in Europe. And this was because of the anti-GMO activists who set out of their way to disrupt meetings, to disrupt research whenever possible in Europe. And it was really, for me, a very sad day. Now, the following day, I'd been invited to go and talk to the European Commission about the future of medicine. And, you know, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a molecular biologist, but I thought I could say a few things about vaccines and so on, and some of the things that were going to be good for the future of medicine. But after listening to this symposium for a day, I decided that that was probably not the thing I should talk about. And instead, I hastily put together a talk that was based on the topic. Sorry about that. Having trouble? Here we go. On the topic that food is medicine. Remember that for the 800 million people who go to bed hungry every night, they're really not looking for fancy medicines. They're not looking for expensive cures for cancer. They're looking for food, and for them, food is the medicine that they need. And during this talk, I gave something that is very akin to the talk I'm going to give you today, although it was given several years ago. But I made the point that GMOs were really not dangerous, and that a lot of what was being said by the Green parties, by Greenpeace, and even by some of the politicians was not science fact, but rather science fiction. As a result of giving that talk, afterwards I was approached by a European senator from Italy. A lady came over to me and she said she'd been totally anti-GMO until she heard me talk. And she realized that what she'd heard was actually a lot of nonsense. And she was now convinced that GMOs were good. And I thought that perhaps this was an opportunity to get things moving and to try to change the tide of opinion in Europe. And so I started talking to some of my Nobel friends and asked if I was going to really start a campaign to try to change the atmosphere and the way people felt about GMOs, and would they join me? And surprisingly, everybody I asked to start off with all said yes. They all wanted to be a part of this. They thought that what was going on was not very good. And so the formal organization for this began in July 2015. And about a year later, we formally organized it and launched it. At the time, we had a little over 100 Nobel laureates who had all signed on to this. I ran a press conference down in Washington. A couple of other laureates spoke. And basically at that time, we called on the Green parties to stop scaring the public by pretending that GMO foods must be banned because they're dangerous. I sent this to the heads of Greenpeace. I sent it to every European and worldwide ambassador down at the UN. And we really started talking a great deal about the dishonesty that was being put out about GMOs. We have now reached the point where we have 155 Nobel laureates who've signed on to this. And I'm always heartened by this cartoon on the right, which was put out by a cartoonist in Iowa, who compares the way in which the anti-GMO people go about promoting stuff and trying to scare everybody. And yet the little boy on the right, who represents a young man in Africa, says, yes, he knows what GMOs can do for him. It's food. It can help keep him alive. Now, food means agriculture. And for the last 10,000 years or so, we have been doing agriculture, starting with people who first came out of the woods and realized they could grow plants in their backyard. We've slowly been improving the crops using what we think of as traditional techniques for making plant crosses and for improving the varieties that we grow on the farms. But given the percentage of the world's population that live in cities, it is absolutely essential that big agriculture continues to go on, otherwise there would be no food in the cities. And so we can't just be opposed to big agriculture because they're big agriculture. We can't just go back and pretend everybody can grow food in their backyard, because that's simply not possible. There are not enough backyards in much of the developed world, and even now in much of the developing world. To give you an example of what we've done as humans in terms of growing food, this is an interesting example based on the evolution of maize and what happened. The wild ancestor is shown on the left of this slide, a very thin, measly plant, has a few seeds on it, but not very much. It's called teosinte. What happened was that as farmers were slowly deciding that they wanted to get more food from the land, and people realized that they could domesticate some of these foods, and the plant breeders realized that they could introduce good traits into these plants. And over the years, starting off in Central America, moving through Mexico, and then eventually we reached the corn shown on the right of this slide, which is what you find in your supermarket today. This is not a natural corn. It's not something that grows naturally. This is something that is the product of human engineering of plants. Now, I want to just give you a quick overview of the difference between the conventional breeding and the new breeding that we call GMO. With conventional breeding, if you have a plant that you're growing and you want to introduce a new trait into it, you cross that plant with another plant that has the trait that you want. In this case, I show the trait as a blue circle. And as soon as I make this cross, then the first hybrid that is produced, half of the genes will come from the so-called elite variety, the one that we started with, and the other half will come from the new variety that has the blue gene in it. And so among all the hybrids that are produced, we select the one that has the blue gene in it. But of course, it's got a lot of genes that we don't want. And so now what we do is to do a series of back crosses in which we take this first hybrid, cross it back to the elite variety. And so then we end up with a plant that has 3/4 of its genes from the elite variety and only 1/4 from the variety that had the trait we wanted. And we keep doing this until we get a plant that is as good as it possibly can be for our purposes. It serves, maybe we were looking for increased yield or more grain. And so we do this until we reach a desired endpoint. And as soon as we reach that endpoint, then we put it out for field trials and start growing it. Now, one trick that the plant breeders learned was that sometimes just by crossing, you can't get what you want. Sometimes you have to mutagenize the plant by chemicals or by radiation. Now, we've been doing this for many hundreds of years, and this is now considered perfectly safe. But the GMO technique, the one that Mark Van Montague and Jeff Shell and Mary Del Chilton came up with, is the GMO technique. And they discovered that there was a natural way in which we could get the genes we wanted into plants by just copying and adapting a natural approach. And the natural approach is the one that Agrobacterium tumefaciens, a bacterium, uses to transfer genes into plants. It's on the gene that gets transferred is on a small piece of DNA called a plasmid. And we realized we could put the gene we wanted onto that plasmid instead of the one that Agrobacterium tumefaciens normally puts on. And in this way, we could introduce new genes into plants in a fairly precise manner. We knew which gene we wanted, and we could move it into the plant very easily. And this became the basis for the GMO method. We now know how to do this in a much more precise way, but nevertheless, this was the early approach to GMO plants and to modern breeding methods. And Greenpeace, who were opposed to GMOs, decided, well, conventional breeding is safe because we've been doing it for years, and precision breeding must be dangerous because we've not been doing it very long. And of course, the Europeans love the precautionary principle in which they don't want to do anything new, except perhaps if it's fun. Now, I want to give you a simple example, a sort of an analogy of what has happened. Let's say that I want to move a GPS system from an old car into my new one. Do I take the two cars apart, mix up all the parts, and then select the one that has the GPS, ignoring what else it might have picked up? Or should I just take the GPS from one car, unplug it, and plug it into the new one? Well, of course, I think we know the answer to that. We take the GPS from one car and plug it into the new one. This is the GMO method. This is exactly what we do. We take the gene from one place and put it into the plant where we want it to go. Now, when you start to listen to the anti-GMO activists, they will tell you another story about this, and they will say, well, what if you take the GPS from an airplane? This is going to make the new car fly. But of course, that's nonsense. We know that this just does not happen. And this is rather typical of the arguments that the people against GMOs use in order to pretend that they're dangerous. And we have to recommend and realize that what's important here is not the method by which we do something, but rather the product. And this is just as true for traditional breeding. And in general, with traditional breeding, we don't actually know what the product is in the sense that we know it if we do it by the GMO method. So in my view, traditional breeding is actually a little more dangerous than the GMO method, although because we've been doing it for so long, we think it's safe. Now I want to tell you a little something about plants. They have a problem that when something comes along to eat them, a beetle comes along and wants to start eating them, they're not able to run away. And so how do they protect themselves? Well, the answer is they produce natural pesticides. And in producing those natural pesticides, they do something that we now do using precision breeding. I like to take this example of celery. I think we've all eaten celery from time to time. In fact, it turns out it has within it a chemical that we call methoxysorolin. And it's actually quite carcinogenic in large quantities. But in small quantities of the amount found in celery, it's relatively harmless, unless you happen to be a lady who's been chopping up celery and making it available to people in supermarkets when it gets packaged. If you get too much celery juice on your hands, then you can get a contact dermatitis, a skin dermatitis. In some cases, people have even got skin cancer from this. But the amounts that we eat are so small that our bodies know how to deal with it. And so when we decide that we want to put a new pesticide into a plant, all we're really doing is emulating something that nature has done before. Now, one of the reasons that I've been very passionate about the GMO movement is because I was really struck by what I want to call a case study. It turns out that vitamin A deficiency is a major problem for children in many parts of the developing world. They simply don't get enough vitamin A when they're growing up. If you compare the probability, the mortality that comes with vitamin A deficiency as opposed to HIV/AIDS or tuberculosis, malaria, diseases we know a lot about, vitamin A deficiency is clearly a big problem. Now, in 1984, Peter Jennings suggested that perhaps we could do something about this. If we could persuade rice, which is a major staple product of many people in the developing world, if we could persuade this to produce the precursor of vitamin A, which is called beta-carotene, you find it in carrots, for instance, it gives the carrots their characteristic orange color. If we could put that into rice and get it into the grain of rice, now we could provide vitamin A as part of a food supplement. This was brought to fruition by Ingo Petraikas, who worked at the ETH in Zurich, still does, and Peter Bayer at the University of Freiburg. And they were able to make what they call golden rice. It became a reality in February 1999. It was not especially good at that time, but nevertheless, they had produced the first golden rice. And if this had been made by traditional breeding, then there would have been commercial production in the field within 2 to 5 years. But it's a GMO. And because it's a GMO, that turns out to be a major problem. Only now will it soon be available, hopefully later this year, in Bangladesh and in the Philippines, we hope. There have been multiple years of delay due to regulation and opposition. And in particular, I would note opposition that has come from Greenpeace and from a number of the Green parties. Greenpeace claimed it was science fiction. They put out a little booklet called Golden Illusion. They claim that because it had taken so long to make it commercially available, that this must mean that it doesn't work very well. Well, of course, they failed to tell you that they had in fact put every conceivable roadblock that they could to stop its development because it was a GMO. Why would they do this? Well, in addition to just being an improved plant, it also was a pharmaceutical. It was providing vitamin A for children. Another GMO that you may know about is human insulin. Diabetics take human insulin. Do you think that we get that insulin from humans? No, it comes from a GMO, from a yeast that we grow in big fermenters in order to produce the insulin that goes into diabetics. Now, as a result of this, Greenpeace obviously felt that this was a problem. They couldn't be seen to be against a good pharmaceutical, something that would help. You've never heard them say anything about insulin. And they saw this as a potential problem, something that if this came to the market, people would start to embrace GMOs. And so this is why they went out of their way to stop it. Since 2005, millions of children have died or suffered because of a vitamin A deficiency. What I want to know is how many must die before we consider this a crime against humanity, one that is still going on. We have to remember that food choice is really a luxury of the developed world. If you go to the local supermarket, you go to any market, you have a vast variety of foods that you can eat. And if you don't want to eat foods derived by GM techniques, then don't. It's your choice. But please don't pretend such foods are dangerous, because if anything, they are probably safer than traditional foods. For developed countries, food is not a problem. We have no shortage of food in this country, but we do occasionally have problems distributing it to the poor. And this is becoming increasingly apparent during the current COVID pandemic. But when we start to use food for political purposes, as GMOs have, we must not forget the consequences of our actions for the developing countries. We can't say for Europeans, oh, GMOs are very dangerous, don't eat them, and then go to the developing countries and tell the developing countries, well, it's okay if you eat them. And what's happened, unfortunately, is that the anti-GMO activists in Europe and some in the US and elsewhere have been going to the developing countries, persuading them not to adopt GMO foods. And this, in my view, really is almost criminal activity. The developing world needs to be able to improve their foods in the way that we have improved the foods in the developed world. And we really do not need to stop the developing world from taking advantage of what probably is the best plant breeding technique that has ever been developed. I would say we could do with a great deal more science in politics. Politicians should listen to scientists, and we could do with somewhat less politics in science. Politicians spend a lot of money funding science. So why would they not listen to the science that they fund? When the scientists come along and tell them something, why would you not listen to that? And in particular, they must stop supporting the idea that foods produced by precision breeding methods, by GMO methods, must be inherently more dangerous than traditional methods when science shows that they're not. You know, for 30 years now, we've been growing and eating GMO foods. Europe imports millions upon millions of tons of GMO foods to feed their animals. But the population is not allowed to eat them. The population is not allowed to grow GM crops. So if it's okay to feed the animals, why is it not okay to feed the people too? And civil society needs to play a role here. I feel that the major religious leaders should speak out. I went and talked to the Pope, and we are hoping still that he will make a positive statement about GMO foods soon, because he cares very much about the poor people, and it is the poor who can benefit from this. Groups such as the Rotary clubs should speak out. They typically have been very proactive in helping the poor. Influential celebrities should speak out. Although that's a mixed bag, I think we have to make sure we find the right ones to speak out. And I feel strongly that the media should really make a better effort to present science facts and not science fiction. And I like to end up by reminding you that non-GMO, to say non-GMO, is a Western indulgence of the rich. It really doesn't work for the poor in Africa who ask, will I eat today? Not what will I eat today, which is what we tend to ask in the West. And I'd like to close with this. On the left is a very good movie called Food Evolution. It's narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and it's a very good overview of the whole GMO, anti-GMO story. In fact, Pam features in it. And on the right is an excellent book by Ed Regis called Golden Rice, and tells the history of golden rice and how it came from the laboratory out into the fields, and hopefully into the fields in Bangladesh and into the markets in Bangladesh and also in the Philippines. And at the bottom is a website, the Nobel website, called supportprecisionagriculture.org, where you can find the names of the 155 Nobel laureates who've signed on to this campaign. You can join it yourself. There is a place there where you can sign on. And there are quite a lot of facts, news, and so on about the pro-GMO movement. And I very much hope that all of you will decide that you too should be pro-GMO and should not listen to the fiction that is put out by so many of the anti-GMO activists. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to now start the discussion with Pam.
That's great. Go ahead, Pam. During this time, if people want to fill in questions in the Q&A session, we can get to those after the discussion. Thanks. Thanks, Pam.
Well, thank you, Rich. I really appreciate your talk, and I really love to see scientists engaging the public, and thanks to Cold Spring Harbor and the team for hosting this discussion. And I thought maybe we could just open it up a little bit and talk a little bit about the similarities or differences between other types of hesitancy, where the public is perhaps fearful of some of the scientific information that they hear about. And of course, what pops to my mind is this hesitancy of some parents to vaccinate their children. And this is very topical now because we hope we will have a vaccine for COVID-19 disease sometime soon. And there's quite a bit of concern that there may be some hesitancy at that point too. And so I think my question is, Rich, do you see some similarities or differences between this hesitancy and reluctance of some countries to make golden rice available to their citizens with this hesitancy to vaccinate?
Well, I think certainly the activists have, on both fronts, really take advantages of anything that they see that they might promote as a weakness. And so there's been a great deal of fantasy that has been put out about GMOs and a certain amount of fantasy about vaccines. The vaccine, there were people who were opposed to it long before there were any studies suggesting that it might take place. But then this wretched doctor in England came along and produced what looked like a research paper, but he fabricated the data. He made it all up. And that led to widespread belief that vaccines caused autism. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Vaccines are probably the very best medicine that we've come across. They're very cheap. They prevent disease. And I think a part of the anti-vaccination movement has derived from the fact that many of the diseases against which we get vaccinated, we don't see them anymore. Smallpox is not a disease that we see. Polio is not usually a disease that we see anymore, at least not in the Western world, which is where, of course, the anti-vaccine movement is very strong. And so people become complacent and they think, well, I don't need to get vaccinated because they've never actually seen the devastating effects of some of these diseases. But I'm always struck by the fact that as soon as there is some small community that has been anti-vax and someone gets measles, And then all of a sudden, within days, everybody in the community wants to get vaccinated. And so there is nothing like a demonstration of how awful it is to catch a disease against which you could have been vaccinated. And I think one thing I would say with the recent COVID issue is that I think scientists are actually getting a slightly better name than they had. I really would thank Tony Fauci very much for that. But I think the contrast between the scientists and the politicians in this particular instance is quite dramatic. And hopefully, we scientists who try to stick to the facts and try not to overhype anything or tell everybody that things are going to be wonderful, but try to stick to the truth, will get a better reputation than we have at the moment. But I would be interested in your opinion on this too.
Well, I think it's a really interesting subject. And I would argue that most people are compassionate. They care about their children. And if there's a discussion about children that don't have enough food, the first reaction of most people is compassion. If they hear about malnutrition, there's compassion. They want to help. But I think there's a disconnect, whereas in the United States, in Europe, for example, it's very rare to see vitamin A deficiency. I've never encountered it in my life. So at some level, it's very difficult, I think, for people to comprehend that there is this type of vitamin A deficiency. So it's sort of going back to what's even more challenging about plant genetics and agriculture is that we're not seeing it. And as you pointed out, our actions and our policy positions really have a huge effect on less developed countries. Whereas with vaccine, if there's a measles outbreak, COVID outbreak, people are seeing it all around them. And so there's there's more of an opportunity to embrace science. And so I think we're going to continue to have some challenges with agriculture and plant genetics, just because those of us who have enough to eat really are not necessarily aware of the challenges faced in other parts of the world.
Yes, I think very often what happens is that because many people simply do not travel outside of their local communities, outside of the state they live on, or outside of the country, they're really not aware of the problems because they've not seen them firsthand when it comes to agricultural problems. Many people, even when they go to some of the developing countries, stay in the cities. They don't go out into the country and see exactly what is happening within the country. And so I've always been a fantastic advocate for travel. I think travel is one of the very best educational experiences you have because you can see how other people live, and that's worth a lot.
Yeah, I think there hasn't been much of a pushback against recombinant drugs. You mentioned insulin, and it's the same for recombinant drugs for cancer. Most people know somebody or have a friend of a family or somebody that suffered from a type of cancer. So it's familiar to us, and we would do anything to help that person. And if it's a recombinant drug, most people embrace that. But again, because we don't see that malnutrition and suffering, I think it is easier to put that at a distance or perhaps use this fear for other purposes. And maybe that comes back to this other question. I mean, certainly there are a number of organizations that are against modern technology in agriculture. And why do you think that is? What is the motivation to spread misinformation or disinformation? And of course, it's not only in agriculture, it's probably every aspect of science. There's some type of disinformation that's being spread. But what is the motivation? I think that a lot of the consumers will embrace what they hear, but there is somebody spreading it that probably knows what they're spreading is not accurate. And so why do you think that is?
Well, to be perfectly honest, whenever I see people doing something that appears dishonest, I always ask, where is the money or where is the politics? Because I think so many times that people do these rather outrageous acts and get involved in outrageous activism because there is a financial benefit to them. And I think in the case of Greenpeace, when they first came up with this campaign against GMOs, this was the best fundraising scheme they ever had. And so Greenpeace are now in a position where they are enormously well funded, and a great deal of it is due to their opposition to GMOs. And for this reason, I think they're finding it perhaps a little difficult to change their position, even though almost everybody associated with Greenpeace who is a scientist knows that the science says these things are safe. You know, 30 years, not a single problem, not one problem with GMOs. You can't say the same for conventionally bred foods. There have been plenty of problems with conventional breeding, but with GMOs so far, nothing. It's not to say there never will be, but so far, nothing. And I would go back to an argument that I always make. The Europeans claim that they're following the precautionary principle. Let's not do any harm. Let's try to make sure that we live in a risk-free environment. But apparently with cell phones, they really didn't bother over this, because we now know that the LEDs on the screens of cell phones emit blue light that causes macular degeneration. I've not heard much talk about that from the Europeans. And why? Because there is a solution to it, even though it's not been implemented yet in most cases. That is, you can put a filter in and stop it. But I think the problem comes because cell phones, everybody loves them. We all love our cell phones. We sit and stare at them, wait for emails to come in. And so here you've got a case where something that was risky, that under the sort of the precautionary principle, you would never have allowed cell phones in Europe. And yet, not only are they in Europe, they're everywhere, even in the developed world now. And so people have different motivations for doing things. They will come up with an excuse as to why they're doing something. But I think usually there's a deeper motive, and I'm always very suspicious that there's a money motive in there somewhere.
Well, do you think scientists that we have failed to communicate? Why? What can we do better as scientists to engage the public? And do you think our scientific organizations need to step up? Do you think we need to have more sessions like we have today? Hopefully we'll have a chance to have a lot of questions from the audience. What do you think we need to do?
Well, I think one of the things that we should do is we should educate scientists from an early age so that they learn how to speak to the public about their science. And I think this is something we've done a very poor job of over the years. We found a few scientists who are very able to communicate with the public. I would say Neil deGrasse Tyson is someone. Carl Sagan was another one, very good at communicating with the public. When I went to school, when I was about 6 or 7 years old, we were taught how to speak to people. So learning how to communicate was a very valuable skill in my school in England. We don't do that anymore. We really do not teach our children, no matter what they do, how to communicate with the public. And I have something which I like to challenge my students with. I say, you have to take the grandmother test. The grandmother test says, can you explain to your grandmother what it is you do in the lab every day and why you get so excited about it, and make her understand the basic science about what you're doing to a point where she understands it well enough to then go and boast to all her friends about what a wonderful grandchild she has. I think this is something, talking to our parents, grandparents, we can do a much better job of. Going out and talking to schools. I find talking to young children in schools from about age 8, 9, 10 onwards, they're very open. They listen. They accept reason in ways that unfortunately very often their parents don't. So I think we have to start young.
Or maybe we need to teach plant science in high school and teach about agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Why not? Why not? I'm all for it.
Well, I think, part of this discussion is you hear the term GMO, it really doesn't mean anything. And in the United States, the FDA doesn't even use it because it stands for genetically modified organism. And of course, everything we eat is genetically altered in some manner, except for maybe on the West Coast, the salmon, or maybe blueberries on the East Coast that you're hunting. So the term itself is, I think, problematic because it's hard to advance a discussion about plant genetics in agriculture if people are using terms that are ill-defined and they actually mean something different to every person. And so I find that term itself is problematic. And when my husband and I, Raul, started talking to the public a little bit more about this subject, we found that it was less a problem with understanding about genetics and more sort of unfamiliarity with agriculture and plant breeding. So it's really the older conventional approaches that are not very well understood either.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And we could do a much better job of educating everybody about plants, about breeding, about what it really takes to organize a farm, to use good agronomic practices. It's not just the plant you have, but it's how you grow it, what you put around it. So there are many aspects of agriculture that are really very poorly understood, I think, by the general public. And I agree with you. We could do a much better job of teaching people about that. But again, I think there are relatively few people who actively go out and try to teach the general public about this. And, I'm always appalled when I read a piece of science journalism and I realize that the journalists themselves did not understand the science when they were writing the article. And so this to me is really one of the great tragedies, that if we could do a better job of teaching our children about science, that I think the whole society would benefit. And the nice thing is, I'll give you an example. I spoke to some relatively young kids at a local school here recently, and there were maybe 40, 50 of them. I talked about GMOs, and they'd all been told they had to write to me afterwards and say, how did they like the lecture and so on. And there were 8 or 9 of them who wrote the same thing. They wrote back and they said, well, we really like the fact that you spoke to us as though we were adults. And I thought this was praise indeed. But best of all, one student wrote back and said, well, she'd gone home, she talked to her parents who were anti-GMO, and by the time she'd finished talking to them, they had switched and they thought GMOs were okay. And I thought, well, wow, this is terrific. This is why we do this, so that we can convert people and we can have them have a different view, look at things from a different angle.
I think I'm not interested in converting people, but I love to open up the conversation about agriculture and have people fully understand a little bit more about sustainable agriculture. And as you said, it's a product that matters to really address the bigger challenges. It's not what sort of technology the seed was developed, but really how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How can we use our land and water more efficiently? How can we reduce toxic inputs? How can we feed the poor and malnourished? These are huge, huge challenges, and it's not going to be one technology that's going to solve all these approaches. And we really do need many types of scientists and farmers and community members to be thinking about this and not be locked into sort of a one approach fits all type of attitude.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think this whole business about pesticides, and the reason I gave the celery example, is that now we know that you can put pesticide genes for natural pesticides into plants and the bugs won't eat them anymore. And so you don't have to apply pesticides because they grow perfectly well without them. This Bacillus thuringiensis gene is a wonderful example of that. This is a gene that is found in a bacterium that grows in the soil, and it produces a toxin that will kill a variety of insects. This is what organic farmers use in order to spray their crops. to keep the bugs away. We can take that gene and put it into the plant so the plant can produce its own Bt toxin, and in this way protect itself against bugs. And then you don't need to put pesticides for these particular bugs onto the crops. This has been immensely successful in India, where they've been growing Bt cotton, and the farmers have been really happy with it. They get better yields, bugs don't come along and eat all their crops, and they don't have to use anything like the amount of pesticide that they used to use. This is a very good thing, and there are many, many things we could do if scientists had the freedom to operate, to do the good experiments, to find out how to improve crops, and in particular, how to help improve the crops in the developing world, where there has been really little attention on finding better lines, better sources of food. They tend to eat a lot of crops that we don't eat here in the West. In the West, we've put enormous amounts of money into improving crops using traditional techniques and now using more modern breeding techniques, because here you can make a lot of money if you do it. In the developing world, the financial benefit is not the same, but the humanitarian benefit is enormous.
Well, thanks. And maybe before we open up to questions, I'll just make one more comment. You know, you brought up the Bt crops, which I do think is really important, and often the public doesn't hear about that. And in the United States, the chemical sprays have been reduced about tenfold over 15 years because of Bt corn. And in Bangladesh, there was a joint program between the Bangladeshi scientists and Cornell scientists, and they developed an eggplant that is resistant to a very serious insect, and they've been able to dramatically reduce insecticide uses. And so I think those stories are really very important to talk about. So I'll hand it over to Rob, and you want to open and make some comments, open up for discussion. What would you like to do?
There's some great questions here, and I think this is a good moment, actually, perfect moment to address some of them. So we have more than 30 questions. I won't be able to get through them all, but I'm going to start. So there's lots of questions about Roundup, which I think is sort of relevant to the last point you were making. So they surround about what the panel feels about eating Roundup ready crops. Also, what about cross-pollination with similar crops? And maybe Roundup has been conflated with GMO in some way, and maybe that explains some of the resistance to it if Roundup itself is dangerous. So Pam, do you want to comment on Roundup?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I appreciated Rich's talk because he focused primarily on goldenrod, and I think it really does help advance the discussion if we talk about the crop itself, because every crop is different, every trait is different, how farmers use it is different. And maybe just for the audience that might not be so familiar, so the Bt crops carry a gene that produces a compound that organic farmers spray, and that's what we were talking about that has massively reduced chemical insecticide sprays. Now, there's another huge pest problem all over the world, which is weeds. It's probably the greatest agricultural pest, and farmers use different approaches to remove the weeds. My husband, who's an organic farmer, uses a tractor. He cultivates to pull out the weeds, and so they're essentially most herbicides which kill weeds. Organic farmers aren't allowed to use, so they use other approaches. So one approach is cultivating with a tractor. One disadvantage of that is that it disrupts the soil. There's greenhouse gas emissions with the tractoring. Other organic farmers will flame the weeds. Of course, the problem with that is that you emit greenhouse carbon emissions from the weeds. You can apply plastic if you're an organic farmer to keep the weeds from growing. Plastic is made with petroleum products. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no simple way to control weeds. So this is the farmer's major problem, no simple way. So what is being used in conventional farms, most farms in Europe and the United States spray herbicides. So these are chemicals that kill the weeds. And until about, I don't know, maybe some of you can correct me, maybe 15 years ago, there were some pretty toxic herbicides that had been used. When I was growing up, paraquat was used widely in California. It's highly toxic at high concentrations, harmful to farm workers. So there was a move to use this other type of herbicide called glyphosate. And it's considered to be non-toxic, less toxic than table salt. I mean, of course, anything has, ideally we'd spray nothing, but as I mentioned, it's difficult to spray weeds. So there is a genetically engineered crop, several crops that carry resistance to the herbicide. So that allows the farmer to plant the crops, and then they can spray the herbicide, which kills the weeds and not the crops. And it's been very widely adopted. It's very efficient. And anytime you have such wide adoption, you need to ask questions about the chemical itself, but also about the effect. And we do know from over 100 years of agriculture that if you're using some kind of compound with high selective pressure, it selects for weeds that are resistant to that compound. So that's also not a magic bullet. And so there is certainly a lot of attention put to this practice. And to go back to the question, there is this conflation. I get this question a lot about, is GMO a chemical? And what is a GMO? And this idea that plant genetics, somehow that biology is the same as chemicals. But of course, when you genetically engineer a seed, you're ending up with a plant that may be resistant to an insect or may tolerate an herbicide. And that's different than what you spray on the crop. So that was a little bit long-winded, but I just wanted to lay the groundwork for what that question is about. And then Rich and Rob, please add to that.
I know Rich has thought a lot about Roundup.
Well, yeah, I think, there's a tremendous myth out there that somehow glyphosate is very dangerous. In fact, as Pam said, it is less dangerous than salt, less carcinogenic than salt. And yet, unfortunately, there was recently a lawsuit in California in which it was claimed that glyphosate was a carcinogen, and a great mass of money was supposedly put out to people who did it. And now the lawyers are rushing into this as best they can. And I think it really is very sad, because everything we know from a scientific standpoint says that glyphosate is just about as harmless as one could hope for in a herbicide. As Pam was saying, the ones that we use instead of glyphosate are way, way more toxic and way, way more dangerous. And so it really is one of these unfortunate cases where you had an uneducated jury, a jury that didn't listen or were not able to understand the scientific facts presented to them, and they came to a wrong decision for what I can only imagine are emotional reasons.
So that does begin to address, though I'd like to hear what you think about this question. So in the US, industry has traditionally held a lot of sway in getting what they want, and often this has been at the expense of the health of people of color. And what he's afraid of is that Monsanto and the like just defining their products to be safe without trials or oversight. So do one of you want to comment on what sort of oversight there is, in fact, at the FDA and the EPA?
Do you want to take that, Pam, or?
Sure. So genetically engineered crops have been around for more than 25 years. And so, for example, the BT crops that we've been talking about, the BT itself had been used for about 50 years already by organic farmers and other farmers. So it already had a very a very nice safety profile. So that helped the government organizations to regulate it. And so one thing that is not thought about too much, but the genetically engineered crops in the United States are regulated, highly regulated, whereas other crops are not. And so I think that certainly we don't want to hand new technologies to for-profit industries and tell them to do whatever they want with these. But I do think that we have many scientific institutions, nonprofit institutions that have been looking at the safety profile of each of these crops, and they're all looked at on a case-by-case basis. So I think maybe you've heard us say this already, but you don't lump all new crops together and every trait. And so I guess I can say that I'm, comfortable with this 25, 30 years review. There have been every international scientific organization, major organization, has concluded that the crops currently on the market are safe to eat. And that is really very important. So it's not just one scientist or one institution's, it's every major scientific institution. And those are the crops that are currently on the market. It may be that in the future, there's a new crop that is rejected, is considered not to be useful for advancing sustainable agriculture. So it's, it's an important question. It's a tough question because there's no guarantee that there is never going to be any harm. So it's really a risk benefit. And I'm glad that Rich brought up golden rice, because the risk benefit is just so dramatic. You have 500,000 children that go blind every year. More than half of those children will die. And we eat beta-carotene in carrots all the time. And there's not been any known health consequences. So that's a pretty dramatic, extreme risk benefit. But it is really important to think about what is the benefit of a new technology to a particular community, whether it's a consumer or a farmer or people in less developed countries.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point there, which is in fact not to conflate chemicals, pesticides or herbicides with GMOs, because GMOs are actually plants. They're not the chemicals.
I think there's another aspect to this, which is an awful lot of people are very suspicious of industry because they see industry as just out to make profits, and they always feel that they're going to be ripped off and that something is going to suffer while industry makes profits. I think big oil is a perfect example of this, that we've had so many problems that have come, including global warming as a result of the oil industry. And Monsanto made a huge mistake when they first introduced GMOs into Europe. They did it in such a way that they made a lot of money themselves. The farmers made very little money, and the customers were expected to pay a little more for something that, as far as one could tell, offered no benefit. And so I think this brought a tremendous reaction against Monsanto, and something that they didn't recover from. And I guess they're hoping, now they've been purchased by Bayer, that the name Monsanto will disappear and they won't have this dragging around their necks anymore. But I think it does behoove industry to behave properly and not to gather for themselves an image of just being interested in profits at the expense of the environment or people's health.
You just answered a bunch of questions from the audience, a lot of which are about patenting and profit. There was an interesting suggestion, though, that maybe GMO plants should be, or provided seeds should be provided to people with a subsidy, in fact, to try to, get them a better reputation. What do you think about that? Should maybe developing countries be given subsidized?
Well, for golden rice, Syngenta, who own the patent, have made it freely available to farmers in the developed world. So there are going to be no profits for Syngenta from golden rice. And I think this was a really good thing. There's something called the Golden Rice Humanitarian Board that Ingo Petraika's Peter Bayer and Adrian Duboc, who worked for Syngenta and put this agreement in place, made sure that this was for humanity. This was not something to allow Syngenta to make a lot of money from. And I think this is extraordinary, and it's a lesson that should be really told to everybody, and particularly to industrialists who sometimes forget that they have humanitarian opportunities and they should seize them when they can.
Well, there's another aspect to that question I think is important too. So I'm assuming, maybe I shouldn't assume too much, but probably most of the people asking the questions are in the developed world. And what farmers here do is they sell their crops at a profit that they need to. They're in society, they're capitalists, right? So they need to support their families, send their kids to school. So they buy the seed. So they buy the seed from for-profit companies. So this is the same if you're a conventional farmer or an organic farmer, and they're willing to pay a price for the seed because they're going to, they're business people and they figure that they're going to make a profit. But it's very different in less developed countries. So, for example, for rice growers, so I've worked on rice my entire career, and rice is very different than corn. So most corn in the United States is bought, it's a hybrid, it's produced by major seed companies, but rice is self-pollinating. So the farmer plants it and then they harvest the seed and then they replant the seed. And so they get the original seed from national institutions and they pay very little price. So there is no profit already in those seeds. And so the same for a BT eggplant. The farmers are subsistence farmers, so they're only growing enough food often for themselves and their family, or maybe they're able to go to the market. And they also are able to access the BT eggplant at a very cheap price, and then they can propagate it themselves. So they're, right now, at least for the few crops that are available, BT eggplant, for example, there's really no need for a subsidy because they can self-pollinate and reproduce the seed themselves. So it's a very different model than we're used to thinking living in our capitalist society.
Though that does require, legal right to do so. So that's still an issue that has to be, made possible.
Right, but this is something that, fortunately, using GMO approaches, scientists in the developing country can do it. They don't need a big agricultural company looking for profit to do it. The methodology is getting easier and easier all the time. And there are now some very, very good agricultural scientists in the developing world who can help their country directly.
Right. There
have always been good agricultural scientists in the developing world.
Yeah, but we tend to drag them over to the US and have them work here, right?
All right, so one more sort of tactical question. Are you working directly with leaders and influencers in the developing world to try and educate them directly against the fear-mongering against GMO? I mean, is there an effort to really reach out to places like Uganda that was featured, I know, in the Food Evolution program?
Yeah, well, so I think Pam has been doing some of this, but slightly different from the approach that I've been taking. I've been using this Nobel Laureate campaign as a good reason to go and talk within the developing countries whenever I get the opportunity to do so. So for instance, I was at a big conference in Rwanda last year in which there were agricultural ministers or deputy ministers from every country in Africa who were at the Congress. Nina Fedorov was there talking, and I spoke about GMOs. I've spoken to a number of leaders. The Prime Minister of Uganda, I had a very interesting conversation with him a few years ago when his son graduated from MIT, and he had come over for the graduation ceremony. And we had a very illuminating conversation. He is totally pro-GMO. The president of Uganda is pro-GMO, but his wife and daughter are anti-GMO because they were got to by the activists. And they persuaded the president to stop a bill that was going through Parliament that would allow them to grow bananas that were resistant to Xanthomonas wilt. Yeah. And it was a great tragedy. But hopefully,
well, I think we don't necessarily, doesn't need to be us. So there was a very powerful and influential ag minister in Bangladesh, and she is the one that worked with scientists in Bangladesh and Cornell to bring Bt eggplant there. And she, her number one concern was her farmers in her country. So she is very progressive on policy, very science-minded, and that kind of stellar policy person that makes decisions grounded in evidence is really very important. And she is really very brave, because this huge country next door in India still has not released Bt eggplant to their farmers, and they continue to spray chemical insecticides. So sometimes it just takes one person. And so I've been really impressed with what I've learned about her. And so I do hope that Rich's campaign and other kinds of engagement opportunities that we can really create a more science-minded policymakers around the world.
Yes, I met also with the agricultural minister in Bangladesh, but the health minister is also very pro-GMO. And of course, health is very dependent on good food. And Bangladesh is a rather poor country, and is a good example of where the health ministers can make a big difference too. There's also an interesting story about Assam province. You probably know some of the farmers there have been growing Bt eggplant, even though they're not allowed to, because they see that just across the border in Bangladesh, they're getting really good yields, and in Assam, they were getting terrible yields. And so this is happening in a number of countries that officially are opposed to GMOs, but the farmers are smart. They want to grow these crops so that they can feed their families and feed the local villages and so on. So I think no matter what governments do, there are some limitations in what they can and can't manage to get away with.
And we shouldn't underestimate the effect of markets as well. So because the EU does not like to import GMOs, then any cash crop in Africa is in danger if they have GMO crops growing there. So it's not just the developing country itself. Sorry, Pam, you were going to say.
No, thanks for that, Rob. It's hard not to interrupt on this sort of platform, but I just wanted to make a plug for the Cornell Alliance for Science. Since you're in New York, they're doing, it's an organization, nonprofit organization, primarily founded by the Gates Foundation, and they're really working with policymakers and farmers and community members, scientists in many less developed countries around the world to really support activities in those countries, so that you have people that are on the farm that see the need, that are going to policymakers within the country. And so I think those kinds of activities are really very important.
So we do have some questions from the audience that still needs to be convinced. So this one is definitely for Rich. So you simply show the process, an attempt to demonstrate the process is the same every time with the GPS example, for example. But does an individual gene always have one trait? And does this gene always express that trait the same way each time? He wants to be convinced that although sometimes food is dangerous, this food produced is safe.
Yeah, well, this is why you do testing as soon as you've made a new product. But in fact, the testing that is done on GMO foods is extreme at the moment. But the testing that's done on conventionally bred plants is minimal, because they're considered naturally they should be safe. And I have to ask, if we move hundreds of genes from one plant to another, we don't know what they are, we don't know where they went, we don't know what effect they have on the plant's metabolism, is that naturally going to be safer than taking a single gene that we do know what it does, we can monitor it once it's gone into the plant, and we are able to know exactly where it went in the plant and to see what happened? That just strikes me as being inherently safer than taking hundreds of genes that we don't know what they do, or even worse, mutagenizing the whole plant and hoping you get some trait that you're looking for. So personally, as a scientist, I like to know what I'm doing. I like to know what it is that I'm putting into a new plant. I want to know what this gene does, where it came from, what does it do in the plant. And this is relatively easy to do using modern molecular techniques.
In the same question and in other questions, there's also a concern about food processing. And so, you know, for example, trans fats are very well known to be very bad, hydrogenated oils and so on. Are GMO foods more processed in some way? Is there any evidence they're worse for you?
Well, you know, to all intents and purposes, they're treated in exactly the same way.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify, so what you have, if you genetically engineered seed, you get a plant, and the plant could be a corn plant that maybe you harvest the corn cobs, you eat it, non-processed, or maybe you process it into some sort of sugar. If you have a beet plant, you can eat the beet, or if there's sugar beets, you can process it and extract the sugar. And that's the same, that's what Rich is saying, it's the same whether or not the plant has been genetically engineered. So the ultimate product is really not going to be more or less processed than the beginning. And so, Rob, I did quickly glance at the questions, and I appreciated this one comment.
Read them all.
Somebody said, can we drop the explain it to your grandmother science communication approach? And I have to say that I think we can drop that now. There's plenty of grandmothers that are scientists, so it's not necessarily our grandmothers we need to explain things to. And so I appreciated that comment, and I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Oh, I completely agree. Okay. There are lots of specific questions from like organic farmers, which are quite interesting, but maybe this is not really the time to address, I mean, non-GMO questions, but there's quite
well, a few. Pam is in a good position to answer those.
I was going to say, but maybe this is related. So what about chemical resistance in pests? So whether that's weeds that develop glyphosate resistance or insects that develop resistance to Bt, this is actually quite a big problem in any breeding effort. What's the panel view on the arms race?
Well, as Pam already said, it's inevitable that resistance will come about because we're selecting for resistance. It's just like antibiotics. You know, we have misused antibiotics to a point where we have bred bacteria that are resistant to them. And the same applies in plants. And this is why sometimes it's useful to have two different approaches, two different pesticides that you're using, so that the degree to which they get resistance drops dramatically. But then you can also use good agronomic practices. Instead of just growing the plants in a field and leaving it open to anybody who happens to be around, you can put plants around it that will protect it and will provide an alternative food source for the insects. So this is beyond my pay grade to be telling you how to grow plants. I think Pam is in a much better position than me to do that.
Pam's really an expert on plant disease, but yeah, go.
Well, that was a great answer, and I'm really not a farmer, but I am married to a farmer, so we talk a lot about farming. But the question is really very, very good. I mean, we're always fighting pests, and even, you know, forget about genetic engineering. Just go back to when we started planting different varieties of crops that were resistant to particular pathogens. It is known that the pathogens can overcome that resistance. And so what farmers have tried to do is do sort of integrated pest management strategies. So they might have a combination of genetic stocks. They might rotate their crops. They might intercrop. And there's really been a lot of very interesting advanced studies, in particular with Bt cotton, and that's been led by Fred Gould, Bruce Stepashnik, and many entomologists and ecologists, and really looking at how they can plant Bt crops in sort of mixtures. So to reduce the selection pressure, you don't want insects that are resistant to the Bt, so they do kind of a mixing. So they don't plant only one Bt variety, they'll plant maybe several toxins stacked in there. And importantly, they'll also plant cotton that doesn't have that Bt gene. So there is quite a bit of advanced science, and it will remain to be a very important challenge and problem as we go forward. And that's true whether or not we have genetic engineering.
So there's lots of questions about climate change. This is quite an interesting one, which I think either of you could take. I could take it myself. So the idea is, of course, that that levels of CO2 are much higher, but plants like CO2. They like to absorb CO2. So if we were successful in efforts to mitigate climate change and actually reduce CO2 levels, would that have a detrimental effect on agriculture?
I doubt it.
I think the issues with climate, it's an interesting question, but the major detrimental impacts of climate change on agriculture now are these extreme heat, drought, flooding. So the changes in climate are creating these environmental stresses, as well as epidemics of pests and disease that are very, very challenging for farmers. So I think those aspects of the changing climate are probably always going to be more and more difficult than the levels of carbon dioxide. And Rob, maybe you said you might want to take that one on.
It's also a question of scale. So the difference in level of CO2 from 1820 till now is between 300 ppm and 400 ppm roughly. That does give plants some benefit, but not much. You'd have to get up to levels that were seen in the Eocene of around 3,000, and we haven't quite got there yet. I'm not saying.
Let's hope we don't.
Let's hope we don't.
We won't be here to see it.
No, we won't. There will be crocodiles in the North Pole, as they were then. Okay. There's lots of sort of technological questions which I think are quite interesting about the actual technology of GMO, of agrobacterium transformation. Does it affect other genes? Is it really precise? Are there any epigenetic changes? Does it interfere with the expression of other genes? And I would add to that, is that a concern?
Rob, that's a question for you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think genetic, with any genetic experiment, you obviously you want to produce a particular goal. Generally speaking, if you're successful in producing that goal, then you want to make sure nothing else is happening, what are called off-target effects. There are lots of really good ways to analyze that now. We can sequence the whole genome if we want. When you're editing the genome, you can edit literally one gene and make sure you haven't edited anything else. With epigenetics, I think that was a great question. It's probably from someone from my lab, but there are indeed epigenetic changes introduced during transformation and also introduced during propagation, which is not anything necessarily to do with GMO. So for example, most orchids are propagated by tissue culture, and they do indeed have epigenetic changes which can be problematic. The good thing about epigenetic changes is they are almost always reset during meiosis. And so when you get into the next generation, when you make those seed, only the genetic changes remain and not the epigenetic ones. And it was one of Barbara's great discoveries years and years ago. But so yes, absolutely. It is a breeding technology like any other. It's just a lot more precise. It may not be perfectly precise, but it's a lot better than trying to do it by whole, the entire repertoire of genes.
Good.
Sound good? All right. We did have some vaccine questions. Let's see if I can find a good one. I guess, well, let me find the most difficult one. All right. Okay. So the people do equate vaccines and GMOs, and in fact, in that food, I mean, this is sort of my interpretation of a rather different sort of question, but in the case, for example, of disease resistance in plants, papaya resistance is mediated by transformation. Actually, it's probably an RNA interference mediated way of dealing with an RNA virus. And in fact, that sort of technology is right now being used to try to develop vaccines against COVID-19. So when people equate vaccines and GMOs, I mean, you made this analogy, Rich. I mean, what would you have to say to them about how dangerous vaccines are relative to GMO production?
Well, the thing about vaccines is that they are the best medicine we have. They're cheap and they work, but there are occasionally side effects from vaccines. So not everybody responds in exactly the same way to a vaccine because we are all different. But in the case of plants, we've deliberately gone out of our way to make sure that the plants tend to be genetically pretty similar to one another, the ones we grow in the field. And so if you're going to introduce the equivalent of a vaccine, which was done in the papaya case, then it's going to have a pretty similar effect on all of the papaya trees. That is a little bit different from the effects of vaccines in people. And so what we do with vaccines in people is we try to get ones that we can inject and give to a very wide variety of people, a lot of different individuals, which is why producing vaccines requires a lot of work and a lot of people and a lot of time to generate the effects. But in plants, you can do exactly the same thing in a much shorter period of time.
Pam, anything on vaccinating plants?
I think with plants, the way scientists do this, they create the plant, they plant them out and they test them, and so it can be done much more quickly than trying to vaccinate 10,000 people to look for safety and then going to the whole planet. And let's just say I'm a plant biologist because plants don't bleed, and it's a lot easier to work with plants. And so you can do a lot of experiments in controlled conditions before you put them out in the field. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what the question is getting at, but that's one aspect.
It was probably a bit more general, but yeah, I just want to say very briefly that that actually vaccines for humans made in plants, or at least antibody therapies made in plants, have become very important. And actually, some of my colleagues at Cold Spring Harbor and around the world are currently making proteins in plants that could potentially be used as a vaccine for COVID-19. And in fact, the first vaccine against Ebola, or the first treatment for Ebola, it's actually a monoclonal antibody, was produced in plants using exactly this technology, Agrobacterium, tobacco, and so on. So in fact, it has been a pretty effective way of doing that. I'm not sure if we need any more questions. We're getting up to 6 o'clock. There is one question here, which I thought actually covers quite a few. And that was, this is from a scientist in California, and who does a weekly radio show on agriculture. Pam probably knows who that is. And I often talk about topics in science. Educate me, please guide me on where I can get more resources, literature, and so on to base what he says on solid science.
That's a really important question, because one of the challenges is, where can the general public go to get real information? How can you distinguish fact from fiction, what's on the internet? And in general, I think it's good to go to nonprofit scientific sources, and the National Academy of Sciences puts out reports that are of topical interest. They've done a number of reports on this, and one advantage of the National Academy of Science reports, again, it's usually a consensus of many independent scientists, and so I think that you can have a lot of confidence in that. So that's National Academy of Sciences. You can go to the World Health Organization. You can go to European Food Safety Committee. American Society for Plant Biologists. So there's a number of organizations that I think put out really clear, accurate information. In the past, USDA has been very good at communicating on this topic. And I think one thing that's discouraging for me is that it is still so hard for the general public to know where to go to get this information. I'd be curious, Rob and Rich, what you think we can do as scientists to make the public, make this information more accessible to the public.
I mean, there was another question asking for the opposite. You know, where can I go to find all the evidence that GMOs are harmful? And certainly, you know, in my experience, if you just do it like Google, we could try it now, but if you Google GMO, generally speaking, you get more harm than good. And I think it would be really nice if there was some sort of clearinghouse. Maybe your precisionagriculture.org.
Well, there's plenty of good information there, but there are other good informations. I think the Genetic Literacy Project actually has some quite good information on it that is usually intelligible to the average person looking at it. The Cornell Alliance for Science that you mentioned earlier, Sarah Davidson's operation, they put out some very good stuff. They have a regular newsletter that goes out. So there are sources where you can go and get good information, but the problem is that a lot of it is not sort of promulgated properly in social media. And I find social media to be actually one of the more dangerous forms of communication about science, politics, anything you care to mention. I'm not a big fan of most social media, to be honest. I think that they do not do the population a great service.
Well, I think it depends how you use it, right? You could follow Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories and you can get very good information. So if you clean your Twitter feed and follow those nonprofit scientific institutions, I think you can have a lot of really accurate information. But that's hard for everybody to do. Where do you start?
That's right.
Well, Mila will tell you start at Cold Spring Harbor, yes?
There you go.
Yeah, actually, I have to make a role which is not one that I really want to do. I should close our event, and it's so difficult because Rob is amazing, but we promised to finish at 6, and our audience probably was ready for 6, right, Rob?
Yep, that's right. It was supposed to be 6, and that seems good.
Right. So I thank you very much, Rich and Pam, for such a stimulating discussion, and Rob for excellent moderating, and all of you for answering questions to our participants. Rich, I'm truly grateful to you for giving us such a strong scientific and moral argument for the benefits of modern approach to plant breeding and agriculture. And my thank you to the audience and to your many questions, and probably all of us sorry that we were not able to answer to all of them. But please visit our website for CSHL Center for Humanities and History of Modern Biology to learn more future events in this series. And we recorded this event, so we will definitely send a link to this event, which will be on YouTube, and you also can find it on our Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory site. And thank you very much. It was absolutely fantastic event. I don't know why the time goes so fast, but I wish you all to enjoy the rest of the day.
Okay. I would just say, if anybody has any questions, send an email to me, roberts@neb.com. I usually do my best to answer all the emails coming in.
It's fantastic. So when we respond to all 400, I don't remember how many I will be told by our public affairs, how many people, so they all can get your email address, Robert, Rich?
Yep, it's fine.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks again to all of you for participating in such an event. Fantastic.
Thanks, Mila.
Thanks, Mila. Yeah. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.